Barbell squats are overrated for growing the legs, and most specifically the quads. That is the context that we're talking about in this video. And I'm going to give you 3 reasons why, and I'm going to talk about a solution to the problems that we can potentially encounter when trying to grow the quads. So keep in mind that I'm not saying at any point in this video that you shouldn't do back squats to grow your quads. That's why I'm going to provide the solution, or that back squats are bad in any way. I'm just talking about a sort of general sense of this is a thing that is overrated and sort of over discussed, and a lot of people are very emotionally attached to back squats. So if I can just get any of you to sort of open your mind to some of the elements of this thing, not to label it as good or bad, that's a win for me. So the first reason, in terms of why I think they're overrated for growing the quad specifically, is that there's a ton of shit involved. Okay, what does that mean? Well, a lot of people are not gym connoisseurs. They're not walking into the gym for the first time and mastering every single movement immediately. Some people spend their entire gym careers just trying to perform an average back squat when they could easily just get on a leg extension and train their quads a lot more specifically. So this is not me saying leg extensions are better than squats, but because there's so much shit involved in a back squat, such as the amount of erector involvement, i.e., are you able to actually stabilize the load on your back from bending you forward? Are you able to deal with the pressure of the bar and the discomfort of the bar on your back? Are you able to get your shoulders comfortably in that position? Is it comfortable for your wrists? Is it comfortable for your fingers? Is it comfortable in terms of just the depth that you would need to achieve to be able to adequately train your quads? All these things are components of a back squat that really don't directly have anything to do with training your quads, right? And again, just to create a very stark contrast, you sit down on a leg extension, you kick the pad, you've achieved a quad specific goal, okay? So just the total amount of stuff, coordination, all those things I listed in terms of comfort, the arbitrary standard of using a fixed barbell instead of a specialty bar, all of those things are relevant factors in terms of how the exercise ends up feeling for someone. And my biggest concern here is just someone feeling like they have to do it, because they don't. So number 2, and this is where we'll get into this, is limb lengths. And this will connect closely with what we're going to talk about in number 3, so I'll just list it now, which is center, I don't know what I'm writing here, center of mass, all right? So we'll talk about these two together because they're intimately related. The barbell back squat, as it's normally done, feet on the ground, bar on the back, constrains the individual to 2 things: their limb lengths and what their limbs have to say about the motion, and specifically how their limbs relate to the fact that they have to balance over their foot, right? So in other words, whenever we're talking about the resistance of a back squat, yes, the bar is pushing the person down, but ultimately what has to happen for this person to stay balanced, just pretend that's a straight line, is their center of mass, i.e. they're combined all of the mass of the bar and of their body weight and how they're coordinating front to back, has to balance over their foot somewhere. Ideally their midfoot, right? Because if they're too far out on their toes or they're too far back on their heels, they're gonna fall that way or they're gonna fall that way, right? And what that ultimately forces someone to do is work around the length of their limbs. So this is a person who has a particularly, let's say, relatively longer femur compared to their shin. And because their femur is longer than their shin, think of it this way, what they have to do is they have to fold at this joint, at the hip joint, a lot more than at the knee joint. Because what happens with anyone who has relatively longer femurs is they go to squat down and they essentially have to balance so much distance traveling front to back because of their femoral length, right? This whole segment is going, it's twisting forward, it's pushing forward and backward, that the balance and the coordination demand makes it so that they have to essentially hinge forward like they're doing a deadlift. And I can't tell you the number of people who have talked to me about squats and how their squats only feel like it's in their back and only feel like it's in their hips and not their quads, who just have a squat that looks like this, and they feel like they have to do the squat, and it's like, bro, you don't have to do the squat, right? There are so many options to work around. So you're constrained by your limb lengths to some degree, and a lot of people will chalk this up to mobility. when mobility is just something that is really context specific. So for example, you could take this exact same person and you could have them, lean, like imagine, someone has straps and they're leaning back and their feet are kind of in front of them. You could have them do an ass to grass squat simply because you've removed the constraint of them having to balance their center of mass over their foot. And even though their limb lengths obviously have not changed, how their mobility presents is entirely different because the constraints are entirely different. So think about something like a leg press, for example, or a hack squat, where you are not constrained by either one of these things necessarily. Of course, the limb length is always a factor, but you're not concerned about falling out of the machine, right? You can put your feet anywhere on the platform, and because you can put your feet anywhere on the platform, you're not constrained by this, and what you can effectively do is change the effective length of your limbs, right? You can move your feet high, low, you can come up on your toes, you can be way on your heels, and it doesn't matter because you have a platform and you're secured by the path of a machine. So is the back squat bad? No, but there are so many circumstances in which people end up in this scenario for whatever variety of reasons. Of course, it could be a strength and coordination demand thing. Of course, it could at least be a mobility thing. But in my personal experience, it's very few the number of people that are actually limited by something like, just the mobility of the joints as opposed to all the things we've already talked about. Of course, it's always a combination. But in essence, what we can do is use other options that are not constrained in these ways to accomplish the goal that we're trying to accomplish, right? And again, this is why I say that it's overrated and not necessarily bad, is because if you are someone, let's say, for example, who for whatever reason is able to squat really low, it's much more likely, and I'm just gonna really over exaggerate this for the point of comparison here. Imagine if your shins were that long relative to your femurs, right? What this would end up looking like is it would end up looking very, very different. Why? Well, because of the fact that your femur here is a much shorter length, there's a lot less front to back distance travel. And what that allows for is it allows people to basically just fold into a pretzel right at the bottom where their butt can just basically drop right to their heels. If any of you know who Tom Platz is an example of someone who has a heavy bias toward back squats for quads and swears by the back squat for the quads because he has this kind of structure that allows him to just, like a piston and without altering his center of mass over his midfoot, squat up and down in a very knee dominant way. And the load oftentimes, in this case, ends up very far from the knee and closer to the hip, or at least more balanced relative to the one that we just looked at. So what is the solution? Finally getting to the solution. If you want to do back squats, if you're like, hey, I love back squats, I love the feeling, I love how shitty that bar feels on my back, I love how shitty my shoulders feel when I grab the bar, what can you do? Elevate your heels, right? So what does a heel elevation do? Well, put simply, it basically changes the effective length of this segment, number one, and number two, it starts the ankle in a more open position. So a comparison I like to make is how far can you open a door if it's 70% of the way open already? You can open it at 30%. But if you close the door all the way, then you have 90 degrees of room, let's say, to open the door, assuming 90 is the stop point. So in essence, what you're doing when you elevate your heels is you're opening the front of the ankle, right? You're essentially starting from a point that you can travel farther into, number one, and number two, you're effectively making the distance between the knee and the floor longer, which sort of artificially makes this segment longer. Again, from an effective standpoint, obviously you're not actually increasing the length of your shin. And what that allows for is a much more squatty looking squat. So overall, again, I say they're overrated just because of how hyped up they are. And again, I'm really talking about this specific to the context of training the quads. And so these are the reasons, if you want to work around it, heel elevation is the way to go. Some of you will need a significant amount of heel elevation. Some of you may need 20 degrees, even 30 degrees, right? So play around with the amount that you need. My advice is to start slow. If you're unfamiliar with a super sort of quad loaded back squat, it's going to feel really, really different and much more difficult than you're used to. So start light, work up like you would anything else. And again, if you're tired of this stuff and you're like, oh, I didn't really even think about the fact that I didn't have to do a back squat, then just do other exercises that are not constrained by these things. Hack squats, leg extensions, leg presses, Smith squats. Those are all exercises that you have available to you and that you can use to grow your quads.